Welcome to Everyday Investor. My name is Nicole Edmonds, and I'm filling in today for Rav Tour. Today we have a really interesting show. We're going to learn how we can transition from tenant into becoming an everyday investor. Grab your pen and paper and don't go anywhere. Everyday Investor begins in a moment. Coming up, we learn from Rachel Oliver how money makes money by transitioning from tenant to everyday investor.
So the rent-to-own strategy is really for somebody who is tired of renting and wants to start building up equity and creating, a richer future. But they have a couple of obstacles because getting into the home ownership space, you have to have perfect credit.
Everyday Investor is brought to you by ProFunds Mortgages, Fixed Returns, Real Security. Sam McDaddy Real Estate, full service brokerage for all your buying, selling, and investing needs. Welcome back to Everyday Investor. I'm Nicole Edmonds, filling in today for Rav Tour. Today we're going to talk about how we can make money transitioning from tenant into everyday investor. Remember, before getting involved in any investment opportunity, you always want to ask 4 questions to start. 1, what is my return on investment? 2, when do I get that return along with the money I put in? 3, what is the minimum cash amount needed? And 4, what is the risk in the worst case scenario? I have Rachel Oliver on the show today, and we're going to be talking with her about how we can go from being tenants and not owning real estate to getting into the market. Rachel, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Nicole, for having me.
So, Rachel, what got you involved in real estate investing? What was your motivation, and what was your starting point?
Oh, my starting point was actually a little bit of a setback. I was diagnosed with a pretty aggressive breast cancer when I was around 33 years old. And that was just shortly after my husband and I had our first child. And it really changed our thinking about time and working kind of the corporate job and asking for vacation time off.
Yeah.
It really just was not, I couldn't see myself doing that, and I didn't know how much time I had left. So I started reevaluating if I could pick how I would spend my days, what would that look like? And for some reason, my mind gravitated to real estate investing. I figured that there's a lot of freedom and opportunities in that space. But at the same point, I really cringed at the idea of tenants and toilets.
As do a lot of people when they think about being a landlord.
Exactly. And because I didn't have any background in it, and my husband is, I call him Mr. No, because he's pretty risk averse. And his initials are Neil Oliver. So it's very fitting. He plays the part. So when we kind of started talking about different ways we could make money in real estate, one of the criteria that was really important to us was to make it meaningful. So not just to profit for our own purposes, but also to make a difference. And that's what brought us to the idea of rent to own, because we were helping another family overcome their personal setback and allow them to get into home ownership despite that setback using our rent to own methodology. And we haven't looked back after 10 years.
Yeah, and so rent to own, is that what you started with 10 years ago, or were you starting with a different strategy at the beginning?
We've laser focused right on the rent to own strategy. I literally cornered a guy at a kind of a real estate investment meetup, and I said to him, I heard you've done 20 rent to owns. And the guy's like, yeah. And I said, well, you're going to teach me everything you know about it. Yeah. Is that okay? Do we have a deal? And the guy kind of was like, okay. Reluctantly, he agreed. And I came home to, one day to tell Neil that I found ourselves a mentor, a trainer, and we're doing this.
Wow.
So we kind of, we'd work our kind of day jobs and we deal with our, 2-year-old and tuck her into bed. And then we would sit in front of a computer for 2, 3, 4 hours at a time with this mentor who turned out to be a godsend. He really did divulge a lot. He showed us what to do, but also what not to do. And in that learning process, we realized that there were certain gaps in how rent-to-owns were being executed and why some people weren't having luck exiting the rent-to-own strategy as a home buyer. And that's when Neil, Mr. No, saw the opportunity to re-engineer the rent-to-own model.
Okay.
And he said, we're doing this, and we're going to do it in a different way.
Interesting. Okay, and we'll get into what some of those ways and tips are that you guys have been executing these deals. But let's talk about what a rent-to-own is. What is the strategy? Can you explain it a little bit for us?
For sure. So the rent-to-own strategy is really for somebody who is tired of renting and wants to start building up equity and creating, a richer future. But they have a couple of obstacles because getting into the home ownership space, you have to have perfect credit. And while some people might be saving up the 5% and they have great income, they are not keeping up with building up their credit effectively. Or maybe they're new to the country, or maybe they just got a new job and they don't have the job history that a traditional lender would be looking for. So there's a lot of little dynamics that come into play, and someone might have less than perfect credit as a result. Well, if they have great income and 5% and less than perfect credit, they can still rent to own by locking in some equity through the rent-to-own process, and optically to the world, it looks like they're owners.
Yeah.
They treat the property as their own. They take on all of the maintenance and the repairs commitments. But in the background, what they're doing is actually with every monthly payment, they are building equity. So after 3 short years, they exit into an ownership position, and they're effectively buying a property below market value because we locked in a purchase price at the very beginning.
As an investor, or as a tenant buyer rather, you're not able to fully buy the property. So how are you able to start building equity and have this home ownership versus just paying a landlord? Is there another investor working with you, or what does that look like? Absolutely.
So what we really do, what Neil and I have really done, is we match a home buyer that is struggling to get into home ownership, but has the 5% down and has the income and is ready to get into a home ownership commitment. And we match them with a family that has the means to take on a mortgage. And that's really technically a private investor, people like you and I who have the means to qualify for a mortgage. We have the 20% down, we can cover the closing costs, and we can go on title on the property that the home buyers have selected to rent to own, because they get to go house hunting with a real estate agent and they get to feel, you know, the butterflies when they find the one property.
Wow. That's when they're coming in, is before you've, as an investor, before you've even bought the property.
Exactly. So we screen the home buyers for the rent-to-own arrangement to make sure that they're a good fit financially, emotionally, and then they start house hunting. And when they find the property that they love, then we bring in a family that helps that family rent-to-own.
Oh, interesting. Okay, and so when you were getting involved 10 years ago, which side were you on? You were the tenant buyer side or the investor side?
We started out of the gate as investors,
okay,
helping other families rent to own.
Right, okay.
But after about 4 deals, the banks shut us down. We were considered to be over-leveraged. And back then, as an investor, I didn't know that there were strategic ways to plan how you're going to build out your portfolio. I didn't know any of that.
From the very beginning, from the first
property.
That's right.
I just kind of thought, okay, well, we have equity in our personal residence. We're going to use that equity to buy multiple properties. At the time, we could do 4 at a time. And then the bank said, okay, you're over-leveraged. See you later. But our phone kept ringing. Home buyers still needed a rent-to-own solution. So we thought, well, let's call some friends. Let's call some relatives. And let's see if there's other families who could step in to take on a mortgage to help a family rent to own.
And you could match make them together.
And we match made them because most investors who want to invest in a strategy like rent to own don't really understand it. There is a lot to learn. It takes about 80 to 100 hours to actually put together a rock solid rent to own deal. And not everyone has the time and the wherewithal to learn those skills. Yeah. So a lot of people said to us, we will help another family rent to own as long as you and Neil kind of manage all the logistics, put all the contracts together, and make sure that that home buyer gets a win-win deal out of it.
Yeah. So we'll go a little bit deeper into the concept of more from the tenant perspective, because on this show we're going to be talking about how you can transition from being a tenant into becoming an everyday investor. So what are we talking about there?
Oh my gosh, that's such an exciting opportunity. So many people in our industry, amongst us, are trying to not just get into home ownership, but a lot of people want to fast track and get right into becoming an investor. So if you're struggling to become a homeowner, you're probably thinking, my goodness, the runway for me to get into the investment world is almost out of reach.
Yeah, and prices keep going up, so it keeps getting further and further.
Exactly. Yeah. So if your credit isn't quite perfect, and if you don't have the closing costs, or sometimes you're deterred because you might not have a budget for renovations, because to acquire certain properties at a really solid price, well, there might be fixer-uppers, and if you haven't budgeted for those types of needs, you feel very stuck. And I run into these types of people all the time, because I go to a lot of events, I meet a lot of people, and I hear this problem all the time. And the wonderful situation here is that rent-to-own is a great way to help these aspiring renters become investors in one kind of simple 3-year commitment. So in 3 years, you can go from being a renter to, as you guys call it, the everyday investor.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you become a homeowner and an investor, and you get to enjoy the profits of that experience.
Yeah, and so we're going to talk about how a tenant buyer can become, like you said, a homeowner and also an investor who has rental income from having their own tenants. So we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to learn how we can go from being a tenant into becoming an everyday investor. Don't go anywhere. Everyday Investor is brought to you by ProFunds Mortgages, fixed returns, real security. Sam McDaddy Real Estate, full service brokerage for all your buying, selling, and investing needs. Welcome back to Everyday Investor. I'm Nicole Edmonds filling in today, and we've been talking to Rachel Oliver about how we can go from being tenants and paying rent to a landlord every month to becoming actual everyday investors and owning that property. So, Rachel, when I've heard about lease to own or rent to own, I've heard of it more from purchasing a single family home. But today we're actually going to talk about how these tenant buyers can become investors as well. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that really, rent to owns can serve different purposes. Yes, single family homes are very common for a home buyer that wants to get into a personal residence. Condos, townhouses, all of those work. But when we're talking about someone who wants to transition from being a renter to being an everyday investor, they obviously need to generate rental income. So we would be looking for rent to own properties that have an income suite component, ideally move-in ready, so there's no renovation overhead, but something that allows that home buyer that is renting to own that property actually generate rental income.
Okay, and so that's where we're talking, we've got an example that you've brought with you today, and we're going to go through those numbers. And whereabouts is this property, and where are you often finding these deals? Are we doing them in major cities or in small towns, or where are you finding them?
We have to remember that rent to own is kind of, your foot in the door. So we try to keep the purchase price as low as possible because it becomes more manageable, not just for the investor that is going to be renting to own that property and transitioning from renter to owner, but also because we want a rental market that is affordable as well for potential renters for that property. So we're not looking downtown Toronto, we're not looking downtown Vancouver, we're working in areas that are up and coming, where there is growing rental demand, where there are market fundamentals that support owning an income property in those markets. And of course, there's some due diligence involved in that process. But generally, we're working in the price point of $400,000 to $500,000.
Okay, so let's go through the numbers. You said the purchase price was $400,000?
$400,000, yes.
Okay.
And in this case, we would want the renter who wants to become an investor to come in with some capital.
Okay.
So they've been saving up and they have, say, 5% down. Which would be $20,000 in this case.
Okay, so the, what are we calling them? Tenant buyer investor.
Tenant buyer investor, sure.
Is coming in because they've got the capital, they just don't have the credit to qualify and purchase, so they're bringing $20,000 to the table.
Correct.
Okay.
So they're essentially locking in $20,000 worth of equity in that property.
Yeah, okay. And then, but they're paying rent too, because you're partnering them with a family who's actually purchasing this, and they're paying monthly rent. Is that right?
That's right. So there's a family that's going on title that is helping this investor rent to owner, and in order for that to work, somebody has to be paying the carrying costs.
Right.
So obviously there's a rental component that covers those carrying costs.
Okay. So they're renting, and what's their rent?
So the monthly rent in this case is $2,200.
Okay, so $2,200 a month, 12 months of the year. And then how long is this going on? Because after 1 year, they're probably not credit ready to take over the property. So how long are these deals typically?
So we determine at the very front how long it'll take for this renter to transition into an investor buyer down the road. And oftentimes it's a 3-year arrangement. So in this example, we're basing it on a 36-month term.
Okay. So 36 months, so 3 years. And that's typically you're deciding based on their credit how long it'll take to clean it up, or is that what you're looking at?
Exactly. Their credit determines how long they'll need to be in the rent-to-own process.
Okay. And now with rent to own, I know that an aspect of it is building up your equity as well. What does that look like from a monthly rent aspect?
Well, this is my favorite part. This is why somebody who is aspiring to get out of renting and into owning and kind of do it, maybe, go straight from mom and dad's place right into kind of becoming a homeowner and an investor at the same time. The reason they would want to do this rather than continue to kind of live in mom and dad's place and try to save up on their own is because this process allows them to create equity.
Okay.
They're building equity from the moment that they move in. And over those 36 months, that equity builds up pretty fast, and it's quite tangible at the end.
Okay. And so what are they doing monthly? They're giving that over to the landlord. Is that right? And it's a credit or a deposit?
So their monthly payment consists of two things, kind of fair market rent, which reflects the carrying costs on that property.
And that was our $2,200 a month?
Exactly. But on top of that, we need to make sure that we're building up more of a down payment credit so that they can exit into an ownership position and that the banks will see them as having more of an equity position at the end. So every month they're paying an extra $600, which is kind of what we call forced savings. And we know that that forced savings will mean that at the end of the 36 months, they are going to have a nice, juicy $20,000.
Yeah, $20,000. If it's $600 a month, about $20,000 then.
Exactly.
Over 3 years. Yeah. Okay.
So they're coming in with 20, and they're accumulating another 20 through their monthly payments over 36 months.
Instead of spending it shopping or on whatever else.
Or on holidays,
if it was building up in the bank account. Okay. All right. So as an investor, or as a tenant investor buyer, we've got our 20K that we're in. We're paying monthly rent of about $100K if we're multiplying out our $2,200 a month by the 36 months, plus that extra credit. So we're in for $120K. But because this is a duplex, you're renting out another portion of it.
That's right. So there's rental income here. So when we know that we're helping a renter transition into an investor, all the contracts in the rent-to-own arrangement support that. So we set it up that this future investor has the right to rent out a portion of that property and generate rental income. Now, they are on the hook for maintenance, repairs, and managing that tenant, and basically everything you would do
if you were an actual investor.
If you were an actual investor. But they also get the benefit of generating rental income. So in this example, let's say they're generating $1,600 a month in rental income. So if you add that up over 36 months,
they're bringing in about $60K per year over the whole 3 years just from the tenant. Tenant income. That's $1,600 a month times the 36 months.
Exactly. So imagine they have their own rental, or they have their own place upstairs where they live, and it's their personal residence. But at the same time, that personal residence is generating $60,000 in rental income before they actually own title on that property.
Right. So while 120 sounds like a lot, you're actually that's over 3 years, and you're actually bringing in $60K from that tenant. So when we look at this from what we're actually out of pocket, so if I'm the tenant buyer, I'm out of pocket that $120K. But we're getting back $60K from the tenants that we have in the duplex.
From the rental income, yes.
Yeah, the rental income. Okay. And then so when we said that we were paying out $120K over the 3 years, some of that is a credit, right? So we're not never seeing it again. It's not going away in rent. It's actually coming back to us.
Exactly. It actually comes off of the purchase price that they've been locked into when they exit the rent to own.
So they're going to see that on the back end.
They're going to see it on the back end.
Okay. And so that we said was about $20K in credits?
Correct.
Okay. And then we also have, so I wanted to ask you this. When you're setting this contract up from the very beginning, how do you know what the sale price is going to be in 3 years if that transaction doesn't happen until then?
Well, I wish we had a crystal ball. And
we all do.
I wish we could manipulate it. But what we really gauge is what's happening in that market in terms of over the last 5 years. Where's that market going? If it's at 6% annual appreciation consistently, well, then we will value that rent-owned property at 4.5% per year. So now you have the delta between 4.5% annual appreciation and 6% market standard. So that delta is the equity that these future investors are benefiting from.
So that's interesting. So from day one, you're projecting 4.5% annual increase, just from passive appreciation, which is great from the family who's purchased the property, they're guaranteeing themselves an annual 4.5%, but that's not actually what will happen. It's in an area that's seeing 6%.
Exactly.
And so that difference is actually then a credit to the tenant buyer.
And that actually translates, if you kind of run the numbers, it translates into about $16,000 difference between what fair market value will be in 3 years and what this investor buyer is exiting at. So essentially, they're using the rent-to-own vehicle to buy below market value and generate rental income.
Right, and they're getting into the market, generating rental, they're getting that experience, getting that income, and also then starting to experience the equity growth in the market, which is why people want to be investors anyway. So that's so when we add all that out, what we're actually in for then as tenant buyer investors is only $24K. We've had a place to live, we've gotten into the market, and then at the end of the 3 years, title transfers, and then we're in the market and it's ours.
Exactly, and that renter is now technically an investor. They could move out of that property and rent out the top and the bottom if they want to and move on to the next project. Yeah,
very cool. And very interesting to look at it more and go through the numbers from the tenant buyer side and look at how, for a lot of people who say, well, I'm a tenant, I'm not even close to being an investor, I don't even have my own home yet. This is a way that you can get your own home, you can get your first income property and get out of the rental market as a tenant.
And the key is that you're fast tracking it. So you don't have to wait, 5, 6, 7 years to make it happen. You can do it in as little as 36 months.
Yeah, right, which is very, very surprising when people look now and say, hey, in 3 years, I'm gonna have my first income property. That sounds very appealing. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, Rachel. That was very interesting. I've never looked at rent-to-owns from this perspective and looking at it as buying a duplex as your first property. So thank you so much for teaching me about it and teaching our audience all about it.
My pleasure. Thank you, Nicole.
And thank you to our audience. Whether you're watching on TV, online, or listening to the podcast, thanks very much for tuning in. To learn more about this episode or any other episode, or to become an Everyday Investor Insider and receive exclusive investment opportunities, tips, and advice, visit our website at everydayinvestor.com. We'll see you next week, same place, same time. Thanks very much.